Hey guys, George of SoundTraxx here. Now, with the recent announcement of the BLU-PNP8, I've actually been really excited for this for a little while, and I've actually already installed one here into my Missouri Pacific GP15 made by Athearn. Now, this is a model that I've upgraded over the years, and I've added things like LEDs, class lights, number boards, and truck lights to this. Now, with the BLU-PNP8, I have 8 lighting functions that I can wire directly to with some resistors, and I've done the installation already. We've done installation videos before, so I'm not going to show you that particular one on this particular model. But let's go to the layout and let's show you my setup process on how I want to get this going. We're going to do some screenshots with the Blunami app, and we're going to show you exactly how to do the setup and preparation so that you can have your model ready to go. So let's go to the layout. Okay guys, now we're at my home layout, and I've got my 1575 sitting here on the layout, and I have it dialed up here on my Blunami app. And when we first attach, it says Blunami V1.0. So we can go ahead and change that. Of course, we can identify the locomotive address or the locomotive type, whatever you want to call it, as we've talked about in videos in the past. So I'm connected. We're going to go ahead and go to standard control. Now, when you first connect, we have our control settings here, so let's test it. We got our control, we got our bell, we got our throttle speed, and we got our control. So we have all that set up in the app. Now, when we go ahead and start making our setups, I'm going to show you how I do my setups when it comes to my locomotives here at my home layout. So I'm screen recording my Blunami app so you guys can see it here behind me somewhere. And I'm going to go ahead and show you just some steps on how I'm going to do this. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and hit my gear down on the bottom, and that's going to take me to settings. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to rename this locomotive. Now I'm going to call it Mopac GP15-1 number 1575. Enter. Now, anytime I connect to this, it's going to identify it as the Mopac 1575. So if I have any other guests or anything over, they'll be able to see what we're doing. Now, DCC address. Now, it's going to be at 3 right now. We could technically leave it at 3 because it's 1575. We're going to go ahead and make it 1575, and we're going to apply that. And then you'll see on the screen how it immediately recognized that as the extended address. So now a couple of other things. We're not going to use directional lighting. And there's a couple of settings here on the bottom. One of them is on disconnect. Do we want our locomotive to continue running, or do we want it to come to a stop? And this is obviously going to be a personal choice, that if for any reason you lose connection with your Bluetooth, that the locomotive will continue doing what it was doing until it reconnects, or you can make it stop. And then also auto connect option, you can where it'll connect automatically to your device, or you have to manually select it. On this particular one, I'm going to leave it at manual. So first settings. Now we have our locomotive here. I may be a little quiet because I don't have the same microphones as I do at home, but right now it's the default EMD 567. So we're going to go into sound settings, and we're going to pick our main sounds. And so the first thing right there you can see is this EMD 567. We're going to go ahead and change that to the 645 non-turbo. And then as soon as that happens, you hear the bell start up, and then our diesel prime mover will fire up again. Now you have a couple of other settings here. We have our overall volume, and I'm actually going to turn this down. I like a little bit lower when I'm at home. And then our pitch, I'm actually going to take this and shift it down. And so what it does is it gives me a little bit of a different tone overall when I'm running my locomotive. So I could have 4 or 5 of these GP15s, which I will eventually, and no 2 of them will sound exactly alike. Now, one of the other things here, and we're going to talk about this when it comes to the dynamic digital exhaust, we want to increase every 15 speed steps. And the reason why we're doing this is because it takes the notching points and sets them further apart. So that way, if you're running multiple locomotives, they're not fighting each other and you're hearing them notch in and out of sequence, so it sets the transition points apart a little farther. So next up, we have our air horn. Now on this Missouri Pacific GP15, it's an RS3L. So we're going to go ahead and hit that. We're going to scroll through our list until we find that RS3L, and there it is. There's one right there. And just to test, we can go ahead and play it on the sound. Now, again, I think that's a little loud. I'm going to change this down a little bit. And then once we get into the reverb settings, you're going to understand why I'm changing this. But I'm going to take this reverb and I'm going to reduce it a little bit. And so that way it has just a little bit of reverb, because we're going to add in a long echo once we get down to it. Now we have our EMD bell, a medium slow. We can test it. That's probably fine. But it's a little loud, again, in my opinion. So we're going to take this down to 45. Now let's listen. You can hear it's significantly quieter. And reverb on this one, I'm going to take this reverb down to about 20. Because I really don't want a whole lot of reverb on the bell sound. I want a little bit, but not a lot. Because when you add in a long reverb, you're going to hear that bell really resonate quite a bit. So 70 is a good volume. Our air compressor, we're going to leave it as the EMD shaft driven. The coupler is actually irrelevant to me personally. I don't use it, so I'm just going to take it to 0. And then next one here is poppet valve, and our poppet valve by default is actually an electronic air dryer. Well, in 1978 they didn't have air dryers, so we're going to have this as a poppet valve. So we're simply going to click poppet valve, and you can instantly hear that change. Now I'm also going to reduce this volume just a little bit so you can actually hear it. And I'm going to take this reverb again. We're going to take it down a little bit, just so you get a little bit of reverb, but not a lot. Now the rate here, you can see the rate will actually allow you to adjust how often you hear that poppet valve or the air dryer sound. So if you're modeling a very humid climate, you can certainly adjust that rate to be a lot higher. Right now I'm modeling in southern Missouri, and so therefore I'm just going to kind of leave it where it is for the time being. Generator, in this particular locomotive we don't have a steam generator or an onboard diesel pump motor, so I'm going to take it and set it to 0. And then we have our alternate air horn disabled. So those are my main sounds. Now we can go in here and set volumes for other sounds. So being a GP15, there are no dynamic brakes, so we're actually going to take the volume down to 0. But we are going to go ahead and set the rate. So we want to make the train stop slower. And we're going to change the dynamic brakes where it's actually going to drop the RPM to idle. Now, I realize this locomotive doesn't have dynamic brakes, and so why would it do it? Why would you still have these settings? Well, because if the locomotive was consisted with another locomotive that had dynamic brakes, we would actually then take the dynamic brake volume, set it to 0 like I did, but we still want the locomotive to behave the same when it's in that consist. And so I've put the prime mover down to idle, because if there's no dynamic brakes and there's no reason to have it, the prime mover will drop to idle, and essentially the car or the locomotive will act like a boxcar. Now when we go into rate, on my personal locomotives, I set my dynamic braking rate to a value of 125. And the reason for that is because that way it takes the longest amount of time for that locomotive to slow and bring it down to about 7 to 10 miles an hour. And so that's basically what we're doing right here. So other sounds we have, radiator fans. I usually turn those down also. We're going to set these at about 40. Alarm bell, I definitely turn that down. That one's more closer to 30. Whoops. Usually helps if I erase. And we do want the low pressure alarm bell enabled, and that's when you first turn on your prime mover, you hear that alarm bell kick on. Now, train brake application. Personally, I'm going to turn this down again. I like to have my values and my volumes a little bit lower. And then in this case, we're actually going to make our train stop faster. And then in my world, my momentum rates are set the same on every locomotive. So I'll actually have to go back and look at the value. I don't know that off the top of my head now that I'm doing this. But we do want to make our train stop faster. Independent brake application. Now this is the brake squeal, and we definitely want to turn that down quite a bit. And so no reverb, and again my rate, I'm going to make my train stop faster, but again I don't remember my rates off the top of my head. I'll have to go back and look at my notes, and we can do that in just a moment. Now, independent brake release. This is the air release that you hear when they release the independent. Again, I turn this down a little bit. Doesn't need to be a lot. Again, you're going to notice, you're going to decide what your settings are, what you like. Now, we can skip through the gen set prime mover. Cab doors. This isn't something you usually hear very loud, so I usually turn this down to about 20. Frequency is okay, it's fine. Relay clicks, again, you're not going to hear this all that often. So we can go ahead and turn these volumes down, and frequency can be the same. E-brake application, that's actually the air dump, so yes, we do want to go ahead and leave that up, but we're going to turn it down to about 50. Glad hand release, again, I don't use the coupler myself, so we're going to go ahead and turn that to 0. All aboard coach doors, it's a diesel freight locomotive, so we're going to turn that down to 0. Clickety clack. Now this is one that you hear this wheel clickety clack in the background. Again, it's a subtle sound, but I don't like it as high as 150, so I'll usually turn it down to about 45. And sound scaler, 2 axles per truck, 2 trucks per unit. There we go. Sander valve is actually the sound of the air opening up and pouring sand on there. It's a very unexciting sound, but it's there nonetheless. But it's really a cool sound effect to add in when you're having a hard time getting a train started. You can turn on that sand and throw some sand on the ground. Fuel loading, again, here's another one I'll turn down. And air conditioner, the locomotive doesn't have an AC unit, so we're going to turn that off. We're going to wrenches. This is another one that is usually not very loud, especially even if we're standing right next to the locomotive. Pneumatic oilers, same thing. We're going to go ahead and turn that down a little bit. Toilet flush. Fireman Ed's got to go to the bathroom, so we're going to go ahead and turn that down to about 10, because again, this is inside the body, so it's not something you would really hear outside. And then cab chatter, I like to set this fairly low, mostly because what it does is it allows us to really kind of just barely hear the sound, but not so much that it's crystal clear that we understand every word they're saying, but enough that it's there, so with the windows open you can pretend you can hear the actual cab. Now when we get into other settings here, RPM engine interlock, and this is where if you're manually increasing and decreasing the diesel engine RPM, the interlock prevents you from shutting off your prime mover while your locomotive is still moving. So yes, we want to enable that. Engine auto start, I'm actually going to disable this because on my locomotives I want to manually start it here on my layout. Grade crossing bell says disabled. I'm going to go ahead and enable it on this locomotive. And then emergency stop here takes the locomotive to idle. That's fine. Now this is where we're going to get into our reverb. So you can see our default is a long reverb. You click that and you have all the different settings. I'm actually going to click a long echo, so it gives a little bit more tone. So now when we scroll back up to our air horn up here, now when we listen to the air horn, you can hear a little bit more of that presence. And you know what? I'm actually going to add a little bit more reverb to this. And again, you can make your adjustments. That's perfect. We got just a little bit of that echo playing in, but not a whole lot, so it gives that depth of tone. So with that, we'll go back all the way down here to the bottom. And then other things you have is equalizer, you have an alternate sound mixer, automatic sound controls, things like that. I'm not going to mess with those at this moment in time. So the next one we're going to do is we're going to look at our lights. Now on this locomotive I have the headlight, as you can see. Then I also have the front class lights, I have the rear class lights, and of course the rear light. Then I have number boards, and then I have truck lights on this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and change all these effects. So the first thing is that headlight to me seems a little bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this from max brilliance on the all the lighting to about 175, and we can apply it. You can see it took a little bit off. It's not a whole lot, but it's enough to make a little bit of a difference there. And then we have our Brilliance 1, Brilliance 2, and our dimmer levels. The dimmer level I actually like to take down a little bit further, so I'm actually going to take this down to about 75. And now when I go back in and I dim my headlight, you can actually see that the headlight dimmed significantly further than when it normally would be. So now here I'm going to go ahead and turn on my front class lights, rear class lights, number boards, and the truck lights. And we're going to adjust these while they're on. So again, we go back to our settings and our light settings. So headlight settings, we have the dyno light, and you'll notice here that it says it's an incandescent bulb, and we actually have LEDs in this. So we're going to go ahead and change this to an LED. Now, this does not change the output voltage, but what it does is it changes the way that the light signal is sent through the wires so that you get a better, more animated lighting effect. And then I'm actually going to set these up because on my railroad we use non-directional lighting, so the headlight will be on all the time. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the backup light. So I'm going to change it to an LED, and I'm going to change this on in both directions. Now my FX3 is my front class lights. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to want to pick my on-off Brilliance 1 from my list. So as I scroll through, you're going to see on-off Brilliance 1. We hit that, and you'll notice that the light changed a little bit in brilliance. We're going to change it to an LED. Now it's actually changed a little bit in tone, and I actually really like where it is. But now on-off Brilliance 1, if I go back up here to my brilliance settings, I can actually adjust this using this slider. So now I go all the way up, you can see that it got brighter. I can go all the way down, and you can see that it got very dim. I actually really like it somewhere around 125, so that it's on, but it doesn't appear to be a headlight, and that's perfect for me. So next up, we have our rear class lights. Now I know from your camera angle you can't really see that. Whoops, wrong one. So I'm going to actually change this again to on-off Brilliance 1. And that turned out just perfect. I like the way that looks. We're going to change this to an LED. And of course now we have directional lighting on in both cases. Now my number boards, you can actually see that they look pretty good, so I'm just going to turn this to an on-off output so that way I can't accidentally dim the number boards. And then again, this is an LED, so we're going to change this to LED, and we're going to have that both directions. Great. Now the last one is my truck lights. Now my truck lights, in my opinion, are a little bright, so what we're going to do in this case is we're going to set this to on-off Brilliance 2. And now we're going to change this to an LED. So now when I go up to my Brilliance CV, my Brilliance settings, Brilliance 2 here, I can adjust this down independently. So a value of 100 gives me a little bit of a tone, but not so much that it's very bright. And so in the screen here, you can see that my Brilliance 1 for my class lights is 125, but the Brilliance for my truck lights is at 100. So I'm actually pretty happy with those, and that's great. Now if we want to go into CV settings, consist functions, we'll save that for another video. Now let's talk about dynamic digital exhaust. Now dynamic digital exhaust allows the decoder to read the load on the motor and adjust the sound of the diesel engine as well as the notching based on what it's doing. So in this case, we're going to go to our DDE, dynamic digital exhaust, and you'll see on the screen here it says begin calibration. That's because this will automatically calibrate. So I'm going to go ahead and move this locomotive back out of the way, and we're going to press begin calibration. Now as the locomotive starts to go, you're going to see it moving at speed step 1. It's going to interrogate that motor, and then it's going to run at speed step 20 for a little bit. And there it goes. Now I'm going to reach over here and grab my locomotive and bring it back. So you'll need to make sure you have a little bit of room to run your locomotive so that way it can calibrate. And when the calibration is done, your dynamic digital exhaust is there. So now we're going to go ahead and move at speed step 1. You kind of hear that diesel engine kick up a little bit, but now when I put some pressure on behind it, I'm going to put my hand on it. Now you hear that diesel engine working harder against my hand. You can actually hear the exhaust kick up. And then when I release, you'll hear the diesel engine drop back down. And that's dynamic digital exhaust, and that's a really cool effect to have in our decoders. Now our last couple of things here I'm going to play with here, we're going to go into speed settings, and one of them is my momentum rates. And when we look at our momentum rates, my acceleration on my personal locomotives, I set to a value of 75, and then my deceleration is actually set to a value of 150. And the reason for that is that way it gives my locomotive a little bit of momentum to carry on, so it doesn't instantly start and stop like it did before. So now when I kick up my throttle, you can see that it actually doesn't take off running, and then when I cut the throttle, it'll actually coast for a little bit. Now this is where the braking rates will actually kick into play. Now I have saved these settings for my locomotives on my phone here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to my notes section. I'm going to scroll up until I find my Missouri Pacific settings. Here's my Missouri Pacific consist functions. Now this is where I have my function assignments, and we'll save that for another video. But down at the bottom here I have my momentums here, and there you can see my braking rates and acceleration rates. So here I have it set in CVs. Now you can do this through the app as I was showing you before, but we're going to go ahead and set this using the CVs because I have the CV numbers right there. So we're going to go ahead and go back to our app, CV settings. Now here's where I can actually go in and set my CV settings. So CV 23, which is my consist, that's my consist momentum rate, that was actually set to a value of 75. So what that does is it adds 75 to my other 75 for an acceleration of 150. But it only does that when it's in a consist. That way you can simulate a heavier train when you're using multiple locomotives. So we're going to go ahead and write that. Now I'm going to do the same thing for my deceleration rate, which is CV24. I'm actually going to add it and set it to a value of 75 as well, so that again it takes longer for my train to come to a stop. Now the next one I'm going to set is my independent brake. Now I've already set my dynamic brake value because we did that in the app showing you the settings there when we were talking about dynamic braking. Now my CV117 value, when I go over here, we can see that it's actually set to a value of 218. So we'll set that right there and right. And then CV118, which is my train brake setting, we can actually see here that it's set to 178, and we're going to write that. So you can still set CVs using the app if you so choose. So if you have a setting that you know, remember this is essentially a Tsunami 2 with a Bluetooth chip. So we can do everything we need through the app, including setting CVs. So now when I go back, now I can go back to here, and when I start running my locomotive, you'll see that the throttle starts running. But then when I turn on my brakes, you see that it actually brings the locomotive to a stop, independent of the throttle. I didn't set the throttle down until I was coming to a stop. Now when this function panel is out, you can see I can still access my direction and my throttle. So I can throttle up, but because my brakes are set, you hear the diesel engine notching up, and then when I release, this way you can load up the diesel engine while you're getting ready to take your train on a run. Now a couple of other things, and then this will be the end of what we're going to talk about today, because this is starting to get a little long. Now, as we've talked about in videos in the past, we actually have the ability to pull this out, and we can rename all of our functions. So in this case, as we've noticed here, we have our FX3, FX4, FX5, and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename these settings here. So on this one, we're going to call this the front class lights. And you can see that it's changed in the menu. And again, I'm going to do the same thing here. Rear class lights. Next one is FX5. Those were my number boards, so I'm going to name them appropriately. And then the last one, FX6, was my truck lights. So now you can see in my settings here that all of my lights are actually labeled properly. So now I don't have to remember what FX3 and FX4 were. The app will tell me what it was. Now remember, this is stored in the app. So if you have a friend over who's going to run your locomotives, have them take a look and they can set it in their locomotive or in their app as well for your locomotive, so that way when they connect to it, they can have these settings as well. But again, this is where I recommend consistency, where all of your locomotives have the same functions. So when we go back to my Mopac list, you can actually see there's a list of all of my functions right there, all the way down through the list of every sound effect and lighting effect and what buttons it's assigned to. So when I get back over to my app, I can go and rename it, change things around, however I want to do. Now the last thing I'll talk about is these little green dots. And these little green dots allow things to be momentary, which means I can hold it down and release so that way it only is a momentary press. The reason this is important for things like the air horn, you can see that the air horn is automatically detached as a momentary button. All the rest of these are latching. But what happens is in functions like, for example, grade crossing, it turns it on, but then in order to play it again, we have to turn it off to now turn it back on. So what we're going to do, once this guy stops blowing his horn, is we're actually going to push this toggle and turn it off. So now the grade crossing, when I press this, is momentary. So that now once it's done, I'm ready to press the button again. Now the reason we did this is because of the way the DCC signals and commands run through the layouts, as well as if, for example, you were running and lost power. What it does is it prevents a mismatch between your throttle settings and your decoder's settings inside, so that way you don't have the function on when it's actually off. So this is why we've done this. Now we did the same thing for the RPM plus and minus. Now again, we have to press it, and you hear the diesel engine notch up, but we have to press it off to turn it on again. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make the RPM plus and minus momentary, so that now when I press the RPM minus, you'll see that it drops back down. Now we're in notch 1. We hit it again. Now we're in idle. And then because we've been sitting here, we can press it one more time, and that'll actually act as my shutoff. And all of these settings are retained in the app. So again, momentary buttons and function naming you will want to do with each of your guests or each of your devices that you have at the house or the club to make sure that all the settings are matched. But the name of the locomotive, Mopac GP15, will be in the decoder, and so you'll be able to identify it on any device. So guys, now that I've gone through the setup process, now we've got our locomotive here, we're going to go ahead and start it up just so you can see how that's translated over. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to turn on our RPM plus. We're going to get the locomotive fired up. Now you can tell it's a little quieter than I tend to do for a lot of our trade show videos, as well as the trade show demo units that we're using and videos here, because this is actually for my home layout, so I don't necessarily need it to be blasting as loud as possible like we've talked about in the video. So hopefully you can hear it on the video, but we can go ahead and get going. And you can see all my settings are there, and when I set the brakes, brings it to a stop. So guys, I hope this has been helpful for you. Kind of goes through the whole setup process of the things that you may want to do with your locomotives. So for more information, please visit our website at SoundTraxx.com. Be sure to check out the user's guides for the Blunami as well as the Tsunami 2 and learn all the cool things that our decoders can do for you.